This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Ovid.tv. In our corporate-dominated media landscape, Ovid stands apart as a streaming service that offers landmark documentaries on historic labor struggles, dispatches from immigrant communities confronting ICE, and special collections of films highlighting pressing issues of our time. For example, their collection on Israel and Palestine includes Lid, the story of the city that once connected Palestine to the world; Layla Khaled, Hijacker, a captivating portrait of the Palestinian icon; and Israelism, which follows the movement of young American Jews battling the old guard to redefine Judaism's relationships with Israel. With films by notable auteurs such as Chantal Akerman, Chris Marker, and Wang Bing, alongside a variety of avant-garde and dramatic features, Ovid offers many things except conformity. Try Ovid today and get your first month free with promo code DIG25. That's OVID.TV, promo code DIG25. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. The green energy transition requires a vast array of inputs: copper, cobalt, rare earth elements, and more, all of which must be mined from the earth. That includes lithium, the focus of today's discussion with Thea Riofrancos, the author of Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism. It's a really beautifully written book tracing the manifold contradictions of energy politics, from Chile's Atacama Desert to BYD's transformative innovations in China to the race to build more mines in the US and Europe. Thea, as many listeners know, is a senior advisor to The Dig and my partner in all things political, intellectual, and otherwise. Before we get started, this podcast is mostly a listener-supported operation, and the place where listeners like you can operationalize your support is at patreon.com/thedig. We could make way more money if we paywalled half our episodes, but then many fewer people would listen to those episodes. And the point of this podcast isn't to make money. It's to deliver critical political education to the left in the US and everywhere across the world you might be listening from. Please contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay. Here's Thea Riofrancos, a professor of political science at Providence College, strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, and a fellow at the Transnational Institute. She's the author of Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism, Resource Radicals, from Petronationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, and the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Thea Riofrancos, welcome back to The Dig.
Thanks for having me.
Let's set up a basic understanding of the topics that you address in your book, namely the energy transition and the mining that this transition requires. I think in the popular imagination, green energy transition evokes dirty smokestacks, tailpipes, all the stuff causing climate change, replacing all of that with clean running windmills, solar panels, EVs. But in fact, all of that requires minerals like lithium, along with copper, cobalt, rare earth minerals, etc., all of which needs to be extracted from the ground, a process that's always environmentally and socially harmful. Lay this out. Why does the energy transition need electrification? Why does electrification require batteries? And why does all of that require lithium and other materials that must be mined from the earth? And to put a finer point on it, what's so particularly important about lithium?
I think a useful place to start answering this question is the fact that renewable energy generation, so capturing the sun's rays to get energy from that or the blowing wind, is place-based and site-specific and also variable and intermittent. So what that means is that we build solar farms where there's sun and we build wind farms where there's wind, but it's also not always windy and not always sunny. That means that we have to get the energy from wherever we are capturing it or harnessing it to where consumers or businesses or other economic sectors are using it. It also means that we need a way to store that energy, even if just for a few hours, to calibrate supply and demand. It might be that the sunniest part of the day, for example, is not actually when the most people are using energy, or the windiest part of the day is not when the most people are using energy. So there might be moments of peak energy supply that are kind of low on the demand side. So to match supply and demand and to bring energy to where it's actually being used, we need a kind of whole complicated grid that distributes energy and stores energy. And in addition, we need to be able to hook up everything that we do to that grid, right? So rather than having a traditional vehicle that we fill with gasoline and drive around that way, we need a vehicle that can charge from the grid, just like our laptops or televisions or any home appliance does. And we need to do that for all of our home appliances and for a lot of our offices and factories and other sites of economic activity and energy consumption. So that's why electrification is so important. Electricity allows for energy to be generated somewhere and then transmitted or transported somewhere else. And it also can be stored over time, which allows all of our society to function on renewable energy, or at least zero emissions energy, rather than the combustible forms of energy that we call fossil fuels or hydrocarbons. Lithium plays a big role in a few of these elements. First of all, lithium batteries are systems of energy storage. This is the way that our cell phone stores energy, our laptop stores energy, but also the way an electric vehicle can store energy. So lithium batteries help us electrify mobility, but they also help us store energy in a stationary sense. So on a grid that has intermittent solar or wind energy, and where there's that gap between, when people are using the grid versus when the most energy might be coming online, large-scale batteries, really large ones, larger than the ones in a car or in our phone, can stabilize the grid by storing energy over the scale of hours in order to then distribute it when consumers actually need it. And similarly with electric mobility, it allows that energy to be stored in an electric vehicle or an electric bus or electric bike and then used at some later point. And, a battery is kind of an amazing technology in that sense. Any type of battery does this. Lithium batteries are particularly good and efficient at it, which is that you can generate energy in one moment and use it in another. And maybe just to put a slightly finer point on the role of lithium and then zoom out to the broader issue of mining and supply chains for all of these technologies, the two most carbon emitting sectors in the US are the transportation sector and the power sector. Globally, it's worth noting that these two are swapped in their order. Globally, the most polluting sector is the energy sector or the power sector, and the second most is the transportation sector. That immediately actually tells us that we are a very car-dependent society in the US, which is why so much of our carbon emissions comes from our transportation sector. But regardless, as I've already just explained, both in terms of our energy grid and decarbonizing that, and in terms of electric mobility, lithium batteries play this key role. So lithium batteries are kind of like the MVP of the energy transition in many ways, or the kind of workhorse technology that allows both for like an electricity grid writ large to function and for individuals to use that energy stored up in other applications, including for mobility. Lithium is, of course, a mineral that's mined from the earth, and we'll need a lot more lithium in order to meet our zero emissions goals that, regardless of what the occupant of the White House might think, are, increasingly urgent to be met. And the US is the world's largest historic polluter, and so it's incumbent on the United States to rapidly and equitably transition to zero emissions. All of the technologies that we need to do that, I've just talked so far about a couple, which are stationary lithium batteries and electric vehicles that use those lithium batteries. All of the technologies that we need to do that require mining. Those supply chains for solar panels, for wind turbines, for transmission lines that distribute the energy, for all of those things, the beginning of those supply chains is in mining. And so that, as you kind of noted in your question, disrupts a little bit our idea of the energy transition being clean or fully green. We have this term clean tech or green tech, which we'll unpack throughout this conversation. But one reason to be slightly skeptical, or at least to treat with some nuance the idea that these technologies, whether solar panels or electric vehicles, are quote unquote clean or green, is that the beginning of the process of their production is in the quite dirty and polluting and contaminating and disruptive process of large scale mining. And maybe to give us a little bit of a sense of scale, according to some of the agencies that track future mineral demand, just to supply the main minerals that we use to make lithium batteries for electric vehicles, we would need about 400 new mines by 2035, which is a lot of mines for just one subset of the energy transition, because that doesn't include, for example, the steel or aluminum that makes the body of the car. It doesn't include the many minerals that go into making solar panels or wind turbines where the energy might come from. And it doesn't get into transmission lines or any other aspect of a renewable energy grid. And so, about 400 new mines in the next decade, which is also a really short time frame because mines are really time intensive, something that we'll talk about throughout this conversation. And a decade might be on the low end of how long it takes to construct a mine and bring it into operation. Of those 400 or so mines just for lithium batteries, around, I think, 70 of those will be for lithium. And the rest are, nickel or cobalt or graphite and other minerals that go into the battery. But I think that, understanding that that's just one portion of the mining required for the overall energy transition clarifies a few things. One is why there is a central dilemma between an urgent transition for climate action, for the need to rapidly draw down emissions that are causing an accelerating and increasingly dangerous climate crisis. On the one hand, that, it's absolutely necessary to retool our societies pretty whole cloth in order to address this mounting climate crisis and swap out fossil capitalism for another energetic system. On the other hand, that urgent task will involve some amount of environmental harm, because mining, which is at the front end of all of the supply chains to produce all of the technologies that harness, distribute, and store zero emissions energies, are themselves environmentally impactful, which I think understates it. They're really environmentally harmful, in their current form. We can talk about whether there are other ways to mine that would be less impactful, but on the whole, mining at a large scale to supply the supply chains of global capitalism creates irreversible landscape change and puts pressure on both water systems and other ecological systems, including biodiversity.
You use the term green capitalism throughout your book, including in the title of your book. Obviously, the capitalism you're describing is not green in the sense that it's environmentally friendly, nor does it mean that it's a form of capitalism that is really capable of solving the climate crisis, let alone the deeper ecological crisis. Why do you find the concept to be a useful one?
There are typically two ways to define green capitalism, one of which I think has a kernel of truth, the other which I do not think is that useful. And then there's a third approach that is the one I take in this book. So the first one is perhaps more familiar to listeners of this podcast, which is green capitalism is greenwashing. It's just, putting a green face on an otherwise environmentally destructive system. And it's actually deceptive because it tricks us into thinking that capitalism can become sustainable. And I think that there's a lot in there in that critique that is valid. Capitalism, as Alyssa Battistoni's excellent book, Free Gifts, makes very clear, along with lots of other eco-Marxists and ecological critics of capitalism, is that capitalism fundamentally relies on nature, yet undermines its own natural conditions of production. It uses nature as an infinite source of resources when nature is not infinite and the planet is not infinite. It also uses nature as a dumping ground, as a sink to dump carbon into the atmosphere, to dump contaminants into rivers, and to literally externalize all of the polluting impacts of capitalist production. And it also has no way to really address that fact on its own terms and to fully, quote, internalize the externalities of capitalism. And so there's a real truth captured in the really critical idea that green capitalism is simply greenwashing because greening capitalism is impossible. The second approach, and this is a more mainstream or kind of normative approach, is to actually say capitalism can do just that. The fact that we produce all these solar panels and electric vehicles and that capitalist firms have innovated solutions to a variety of ecological or climatic problems shows that capitalism has no problem becoming sustainable, right? And I think that that one is easier to just dismiss because it comes from a sort of boosterist position that doesn't have a lot of basis in reality, because insofar as capitalism is greening, it involves a tremendous amount of state action and also civil society pressure. It's not something that capitalism is doing on its own accord. It is a way that some capitalist firms and sectors and investors respond to state direction and to social, and in some cases, but not that often, investor pressure. And so that leads me to how I define green capitalism, or at least the working definition that I use in this book, which are precisely those sectors, activities, or supply chains in our economy that someone with some power has labeled as green, has said, this is a way that we are producing zero emissions energy, or this is a technology that can help address adaptation to climate change. Whether it's proven or unproven scientifically, right? So we have lots of unproven, quote unquote, green technologies, like geoengineering or carbon capture that at least are unproven in a commercially viable way. And then we have proven green technologies like lithium batteries, which absolutely do what they are advertised to do, which is store intermittent energy and allow us to use it off grid. And also solar panels and wind turbines do what they say they will do. And capitalist firms may own those, may invest in those, may profit from them. And so when I talk about green capitalism, I'm talking about both the economic activities that are called green by the companies themselves, by investors, by, in many cases, regulatory agencies or governments that designate, some activities as green and others as not. I'm talking about the financial investments that go into those to allow for those processes, to invest in the manufacturing of solar panels, for example. And I'm talking about the observable material implications of building out an energy system that functions on renewable energy. And I'm also talking about it as a political project. So that, what I just named is a bunch of economic processes that I call green capitalism. Not saying at all that means capitalism is becoming self-sustainable environmentally, but just that there are these new arenas of investment that we can call, quote unquote, green. And then secondarily, it's also a political project because, that boosterish idea that may be propaganda, but is politically relevant, which is the idea that market forces and innovation and profit-seeking firms are going to help us out of this crisis. That is the political project of green capitalism, convincing constituencies, politicians, lobbying groups making these claims. The idea that through a kind of elite alliance of well-intentioned capitalists, the state using certain incentives or tools, and a kind of expert consensus, we are going to green our entire economy. That is a political gambit. That's a political project that has actually shown itself to be rather vulnerable and shaky in the West, especially. But green capitalism as an economic endeavor won't happen at all without the political project element, because green capitalists are extremely dependent on state intervention in order to get their projects off the ground and in order to actually profit from those projects.
And in a way, it sounds like green capitalism is a political project to ensure that the climate crisis and the energy transition that requires doesn't become a political crisis for capitalism.
Yeah, it's a way, the idea is that it's a way to transition to zero emissions energy and to make other aspects of our economy net zero, let's say, without fundamentally changing the capitalist mode of production, or even changing like the specific forms of consumption that, for example, maybe affluent Americans are used to. So it's changing everything by changing nothing. It's changing the fact that capitalism is implicated in causing a climate crisis without changing anything about the fundamentals of capitalism. That's the conceit. But what's interesting is that in order to, as I said, get any of these investments, whether solar farms or lithium battery production or lithium mining, off the ground, a lot of politics is necessary.
Let's turn to the Salar de Atacama, a breathtaking, truly breathtaking desert landscape stretching across Chile's northern reaches. It contains nearly 1/3 of the world's lithium reserves. It's also home to Chile's massive copper industry. Indigenous people live in the Atacama too, and have lived there for a very long time. Miners who work in the copper industry and now the lithium industry live there as well. What sort of ecosystem is the Atacama and its salares, or salt flats? Who are the Atacameño people and miners who call the region home? How has copper already transformed that landscape and that ecology and those societies over the decades? And lastly, very critically, where do these giant lithium mines fit into it all?
About 1/5 of the world's lithium supply comes from Chile. Chile is the second largest global producer. And all of that Chilean lithium comes from the Atacama Desert, which is an absolutely astounding set of complex and fascinating and beautiful landscapes that are so beautiful that it's one of Chile's top 2 tourist destinations as well. The Atacama Desert is the world's oldest desert. It's the world's driest desert. And it's also just the second driest place on Earth, aside from a subregion of Antarctica. And so this is a really unique environment that's extremely arid, extremely high altitude, extremely high solar radiation, extremely variable in temperature from day to night. And for all those reasons, scientists call the Atacama Desert a poly-extreme environment. It's extreme in all of these different ways, in addition to it's extremely salty, or on the salt flats themselves, which are these salt crusts that pepper the desert. There are dozens of them. The Atacama salt flat is the largest of those salt flats. It's about 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island, where we're currently recording from. It's the 3rd largest salt flat in the world. So it's a very large salt flat. And it's surrounded by these towering Andean mountains, some of which are volcanic. So this is the kind of drama of the landscape. Underneath that salt flat is where 2 of the world's largest lithium mining companies get 1/5 of the world's lithium. And they do so by pumping to the surface lithium-rich brine, this salt water that has lithium in it, lithium ions dissolved in it, pumping that to the surface of the salt flat, and then arraying that lithium-rich liquid in these mega evaporation ponds. And I really suggest that listeners either look at the cover of my book or look up Google Images to see what this mine looks like. It's unlike any other mine that you've probably thought about before. It's not a hard rock mine, though lithium does take that form elsewhere. It is a liquid mine. And the liquid needs to be concentrated and evaporated. That happens through the intense sun that I already mentioned. And then it's refined chemically elsewhere in Chile before entering into global supply chains. That salt flat is a set of habitats. You know, the Spanish conquerors, when they first came to Chile and they first visited the Atacama Desert, they thought it was bereft of life. Not only were they totally wrong about that, but even the salt crust itself, even the lithium deposits have life in them. And so what I discovered, and this was one of the most fascinating parts of my book in terms of the research I had to do, is that the lithium deposits underground have microorganisms in them. The salty lagoons that are on the surface of the salt crust also have microorganisms, as well as slightly larger organisms like brine shrimp living in them. Snacking on those brine shrimp are these beautiful pastel pink flamingos that are endemic to the region and that migrate and stop on the salt flat as part of their seasonal migration. And so the whole area is actually brimming with life that has managed to survive and thrive despite the really intense conditions of salinity, of high altitude, of temperature variability, of intense sun, of all of these extreme elements. If you leave the center of the salt flat and go to the perimeter, there are longstanding indigenous communities that border the salt flat. Specifically around the Atacama salt flat, which, as I mentioned, is the really large one where the two large-scale lithium mines in Chile that are operational exist. Around that salt flat, there are 18 Atacameño indigenous communities. And what's amazing about those communities, I mean, there are many things. They have lived there for, there's been human life in this region for 10 or 12,000 years. So these are really long-standing indigenous communities that for millennia before Spanish conquest were part of a broader network of indigenous peoples that stretched further up the mountains and then down all the way down to the Chilean coast, a network of trade and livelihoods and cultural exchange. And so these contemporary communities that live there today have inherited all of this ancestral knowledge about how to live and create culture and economic livelihoods and food and agriculture in such an arid environment. And so, visiting these communities, I was struck by the amazing irrigation systems and the very diverse forms of agriculture. Like I remember seeing quince and maize, for example, and figs, I think it was, some of these Mediterranean crops, like in an area that is quite arid, but all supported by this really meticulous, communally built irrigation system. And so this whole area is a natural landscape, a landscape of non-human nature. It's a social landscape and a cultural landscape. The mountains are really important to Atacameño culture, and each community has a deified mountain that it has a spiritual relationship to. And all of this is under threat by a number of extractive activities that take place in the region, in addition to global warming and climate change itself. And so, as I already mentioned, a fifth of the world's lithium comes from here. Chile is also the number one copper producer on Earth, and the copper mines are nearby as well. And in addition, you have the fact that global warming makes deserts more arid. And so the copper uses a lot of water. The lithium mining disrupts the underground water system. And global warming is also contributing to more drought. And so those agricultural activities and the sort of cultural meanings associated with them are under threat by these compounding forms of ecological and climatic change that are themselves linked to long histories of resource extraction in the same region. So mines obviously involve mine workers, even if contemporary mining requires less workers per unit of output than traditional or old-fashioned mining did. Mining today is much more capital and technology intensive to the point that we even have driverless vehicles and drones and all sorts of remote operated technologies that are part of the mining process. But there are still workers. Some of those workers might come from the 18 indigenous communities that I mentioned. Others of them may live in some of the larger cities that are in the northern part of Chile. There's a whole fascinating history of mine worker militancy. And it's not just history. There was, during the time that I was working on this project, there was a long strike at one of those 2 lithium mines that I mentioned. And so mine workers are still militant. They do still strike. But the history is of really tremendous militancy, including under the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. Copper mine workers were a really important force in contesting the dictatorship and, not unrelated to that, also a major target of regime repression. And there's a quite tragic story of some of these operations of disappearing and murdering people that the Pinochet regime was famous for, but specifically targeting mine workers in the city of Calama in northern Chile, who were then buried in the Atacama Desert. And so victims, including mine workers of the Pinochet regime, are also buried underneath the ground, not far from where the lithium is being extracted.
And that was during the infamous Caravan of Death.
Yes, exactly.
Lithium exists in various forms throughout the world. Lithium shaped by different geological processes and which thus require different modes of mining. Where are lithium deposits, which are distinct from resources and reserves, where are they located globally and in what sort of different forms?
Yeah, I'm glad you point out the difference of geological terminology, and these 3 terms of deposits, resources, and reserves get conflated a lot in media reporting, sometimes even in the academic literature. I won't get too granular here, but I think the most important thing to know is that deposits are any deposit of some valuable mineral, some mineral that has some economic application. Anywhere on Earth, we might say, okay, we've discovered a deposit of this, we've discovered a deposit of that. That just means that we know the mineral exists underground, or the hydrocarbon, right? Like an oil deposit or a coal deposit. So that's a deposit. We know it's there. But what resources and reserves get at is whether or not it's technologically feasible to extract that mineral. So that's a resource. That means we don't just know it's there, we also know how to extract it. We have the proper technology to extract it. And a reserve is the narrowest and therefore the most reliable category of the 3, which is not only that it's technologically viable to extract a deposit, but also that it is profitable. It's quote unquote economic to do so. Like it wouldn't cost more to extract it than to sell the mineral on the market after the fact. And so in terms of reserves, Chile has the world's largest reserves. Yeah, it's a fifth of global production, but it's the top volume of known reserves that we have in the world. Going from there, Australia has the second largest reserves, though Australia is the number 1 producer. So reserves don't tell you about like the rate of production necessarily. But regardless, we can see that Australia and Chile are the most important in terms of mining and the most important in terms of verified reserves. The US also has large reserves. Argentina, Chile's neighbor, and a very similar kind of set of salt flats and ecology and types of resource deposits, also has quite large reserves. China has really large reserves. Zimbabwe has sizable reserves. When we get into resources, we can bring in other countries where, again, we know it exists and it might be possible to exploit, but we're, not always sure about how economic it would be. But there we get to Mexico, Brazil, Russia, Portugal, place that I did research. I mean, I could keep going.
Serbia,
very important. Yeah, major protests around lithium mining there. So, just to zoom out from all of this, a few things are worth mentioning. One is that lithium, by that very list of countries, which was not an exhaustive list that I just gave, is relatively abundant. It is not geologically scarce. There have been moments of market shortages, but those are market shortages, not underlying shortages in the Earth's crust. The second point is that lithium takes a really wide variety of forms, more so than other minerals, like much more so than, for example, copper, let's say. Lithium is what's known as an alkaline metal, so it's very reactive. In nature, it can't stably exist as a metal on its own. It has to exist in compounds with other elements. And so that means that there are lots of different types of lithium deposits. The brine deposits that I mentioned in Chile and Argentina. There are also brine deposits in the US and China, but there are also hard rock deposits in Australia and elsewhere in the world. There are clay deposits. Some of the US deposits are clay. There are geothermal brine deposits, which is, warm brine heated from, underneath the Earth's surface. So there's a whole range of deposits types, some of which, for example, clay, we've never actually extracted. And we'll see in a few years because there are certain clay lithium mines that are under construction right now. So we'll find out soon whether it works. But that's what makes lithium quite interesting to look at, is that it was for many years a pretty small market. And now it's poised to grow really dramatically, which means we're going to start trying to extract lithium from sources that we've never extracted before or never developed the technology to do so. But it also means that the environmental impacts of lithium mining are kind of unique to the deposit type. So in Australia, as I said, it's hard rock mining. It's more like traditional, more the image of mining that might come to mind when we think about what a mine is. And that is less disruptive to the water system than the mining in Chile, but it's much more carbon intensive, including because very little processing takes place in Australia. All of that lithium ore is put on container ships and goes to China, and those container ships are carbon intensive. And it also creates a lot of physical waste, right? So we could look at brine versus clay. Clay involves probably sulfuric acid, which is very environmentally damaging, in order to separate the lithium from the clay, to hard rock, right? And be really specific about what are the environmental impacts and how might we minimize them, hopefully.
In the case of Chile, it's mining water, but the Chilean government hasn't really understood how fresh water is being impacted. Meanwhile, the companies say, it's fine, actually, we're not mining water at all, we're mining brine. Where does water fit in to the Atacama's ecology, and where then does that water fit into the highly conflictive politics surrounding extraction in the region? And lastly, why everywhere more generally are the political conflicts around mining also so often the politics of water?
The Atacama Desert, as I mentioned, is the driest desert on Earth. And so it's a extreme case of what is generally true about deserts, which is that they are water negative environments naturally. There is more evaporation than there is precipitation. And this basic fact sets up a lot of the conflicts around mining in Chile, including also around copper mining, which is very freshwater intensive. So there is an important distinction to understand the basics of the water system in the Atacama Desert. The salt crust that I mentioned, the salt flats, which is where the lithium mining takes place, underneath those salt flats is the lithium brine, which is very salty water. It's actually even saltier than seawater, which is the kind of brine, water we might be more familiar with. So it's super salty water. It has lithium ions in it, and that's what's pumped to the surface. So as you move towards the edge of the salt flat and then to the rest of the desert beyond the salt flats, underneath the ground are freshwater aquifers. Those are actually very old aquifers, meaning the water in them accumulates over many, many decades because, as I said, it's a water negative environment. It doesn't rain very often. And so those freshwater aquifers are very important to preserve because they are the freshwater source of the desert. The kind of main conflict comes in with how extracting brine water from underneath the salt flat does or does not impact the fresh water that's right outside the salt flat. The mining companies put a tremendous amount of PR effort into making the argument that brine isn't water, and therefore we should not care about the removal of brine. Brine is just like this weird thing that nature has produced, but it has no environmental, let alone human or social value. That's not true on the merits. Brine is water. It is a type of water, according to any chemist that defines what water is. And, more to the point, when the lithium brine is evaporated, what evaporates is water. So that is a loss of water from the system. But, what's most important is whether, from the perspective of indigenous communities and environmental regulators and also other livelihoods like agriculture that water is essential for, is whether removing all this brine impacts the state of the fresh water surrounding the salt flat. And what the evidence suggests is that withdrawing salt water actually draws the freshwater aquifers, the water in those aquifers, closer into the salt flat, because there is a kind of porous boundary between the underground salt water and the underground freshwater. They are part of the same hydrological system. So just if you kind of imagine in your head, like sucking out the salt water draws towards the nucleus of the salt flat, the center of the salt flat, the fresh water, making it less accessible to humans. For a long time, there was regulatory concern about this. There were community concerns about it. Now we have quite solid evidence that this is happening and that there is less access to fresh water for the indigenous communities and other people in the area that rely on it. And this is part of a larger issue with mining, which is that it really depends on water, and it also really can contaminate water as well. I haven't gotten into that here because that's somewhat less relevant in this case, but relevant in other cases of lithium mining and for sure in lots of large-scale mines of other minerals around the world, which is that mining both uses water and it contaminates water because of the chemicals used in mining. And this dual effect of mining on water, making there be less of it and making what water there is less useful for humans or maybe even toxic, is why water is so often at the center of anti-mining politics. In fact, there's often signs or placards at, anti-mining protests saying, we value water, not minerals, or water over mining, or,
water is life.
Water is life, exactly. And this can sound very kind of like philosophical. And even to your point, like yes to life, no to mining is the name of a global network, anti-mining network. And by life, many things can be meant, but one of them is really water and the access to water. And communities that are facing mining projects are often really concerned about water impacts. But I think that it's worth noting that there's not any automatic or mechanical relationship between impacts, ongoing impacts or, potential future impacts on a water system and protest. What researchers have found is that it's not the case that every community that lives in an arid area where there's mining or lives in an area where, mining uses a lot of water protest. What usually needs to combine is a threat to water, a set of cultural practices that ascribe meaning to that water, like that water is sacred or that water is essential to our economic livelihood or our way of life, and some basics of collective action and organizing in order to translate the threat onto water into some kind of political or social fact. But when those elements combine, we tend to have really a lot of concern, but also like oftentimes quite militant protest to protect water from mining.
Yeah, to get into that militant protest a bit more, everywhere you traveled for this research, and in many cases, everywhere we traveled together, in each of these places, there was lithium mining either already underway or planned, and there was resistance from local people fighting to stop that mining. In the Salar de Atacama, in Rhyolite Ridge and Thacker Pass, Nevada, and in Covas do Barosso, Portugal. You write, quote, "Militant resistance to extraction has proliferated along the ever-expanding frontiers of global capitalism, especially as affected communities have grown more environmentally conscious of the threats that mining poses to their land and water, and less tolerant of the social dislocation and violent repression that so often accompanies extraction. For corporations, these conflicts, whatever their causes, directly translate into costs." What does What does this global array of resistance movements to lithium mining look like? How does it fit into a larger, really quite vast global network of popular organizations opposed to all different forms of mining? And lastly, how does this popular resistance more generally shape the emerging political economy of the entire lithium industry?
Over the past couple of decades, there's been a major increase in the frequency and militancy of anti-mining protest. Frequency, probably we know what that means. It's more common for there to be anti-mining protest, or maybe a different way to put it is that it's harder for companies to convince communities that mining is in their interests and that they should welcome it. And by militancy, I mean that the protest has grown more oppositional. Mining has always been an arena of social conflict. I mentioned mine workers earlier, and they were famous for their labor militancy. But the goal was not necessarily to shut down the mine. The goal was to temporarily shut down the mine via a strike to then get better wages, better benefits, in some cases, more radical demands around worker ownership or public ownership. But today, the goal of a lot of the social conflict or social protest around mining increasingly is in opposition to the extraction itself. It may end up being a negotiation if the community is not able to stop the mine. Sometimes the goal might be negotiation, but more often than it used to be in the past, there are communities that oppose mining to court. And this kind of wave of resistance to mining, which the mining industry is acutely aware of and is often a major topic of mining industry conventions. How do we get the so-called social license to operate when communities are more and more skeptical of mining? This has a particular history in Latin America where we could say communities and social movements over the past couple of decades have really innovated a repertoire of resistance that involves wholesale opposition to the mine and has a whole set of languages and tactics that attend to that oppositional stance. So this is just a medium time frame historical process that has been going on since the early 2000s. But the interesting thing is that this heightening resistance to mining has intersected with the energy transition, meaning it's intersected with a political, economic, and material process that is requiring and demanding more mining. And so at a point in history where communities are less enthusiastic about mining, to put it mildly, more mining projects are being planned around the world. And as my case of lithium shows us, often actually in places that where maybe the particular type of mining project is new, not per se that they've never had mining before, because oftentimes there are layers of histories of mining in the same places, but they maybe have never seen a clay lithium mine before. And so the environmental impacts are uncertain and all the more concerning for that reason. And so you have novel types of mining and more volume of mining being demanded, meeting this kind of intense force of resistance. And this absolutely shapes the political economy of the energy transition. We often think about, supply chains these days, and we think very much about vulnerable supply chains or disruptions to supply. Oftentimes, we might think about geopolitics, for example, being a source of those disruptions, changing, international relations between countries, affecting trade relations, something that we'll talk about a lot more later. But of course, a workers' strike can shut down mines and then impact supply and change market prices. If there was really massive coordinated community action in a certain mining sector or in a series of mines, that could slow down or stop production and therefore put upward pressure on prices or tighten supply. And maybe to even put it more dramatically, Latin America in particular, given all of the more militant anti-mining and anti-extractive protests that's been happening there, is a place of many stranded assets of mining projects, meaning mining projects that have been around for a decade, that multiple investors have shown interest in, and then shied away from, that different governments have tried to promote, but have not moved past the exploration phase because protest was so intense that investors got scared off. And so this is, if we want to understand the basic economic fundamentals of these supply chains and of mining in particular, we really have to understand protest as a political economic force, as a process that's part of political economy alongside more elite forms of political economy, whether corporations, investors, or state officials.
And it's both the costs at the point of extraction that can be imposed by protesters whose actions delay the opening of a mine, the functioning of a mine, but on the other end of the supply chain, the consumer-facing end, let's say a car company, there's also a concern about the costs that protests can impose in terms of reputational cost.
Absolutely. Mining, like any kind of nature-facing economic sector, meaning, mining is a place where capital and nature meet. And mining is place-based. It's in particular locations. It is looking for particular deposits. You can't mine gold anywhere. There has to at least be a viable deposit to mine, which means that as soon as a mining company has a basic sense that this might be a profitable investment and they start constructing the mine, they are laying down equipment and installations and a physical plant. They are cultivating expertise among their personnel. They are getting specific permits and licenses from the state, all of which means they've invested a lot financially in a specific location, which is what then gives leverage to communities, also host governments, over that mine, because the company is very reluctant to lose all that investment. So that if they have to pay off a local official, if they have to renegotiate a contract to make locals or the national government happier, if they have to appease protesters, they're going to try to do it because they would rather do all of those things, as costly as they might be, than lose the entire investment or their future returns over it. That does not mean that mining companies are powerless. The other side of this is that they will often do anything, including violence, to ensure that their mines get built and that they get a return on their investment. And that return is often thought of on the scale of multiple decades. And it's not a quick turnaround. This is not like a day trading thing. This is it might take 30 years or 20 years to fully recoup your investments. And so it's not an accident for that reason that the mining sector is the most dangerous on earth for protesters, because they will use, the protesters have their leverage that they're using to stop the mining operations in place. And the mining company, might resort to really nefarious means to stamp that protest out.
You write, quote, "Extractive frontiers offer a portal to the very origins of capitalist modernity. The model of extraction as we know it today, large-scale, export-oriented, and socially and environmentally reckless, originated in the European conquest of the Americas," and quote, "Whether during the initial era of European conquest of the Americas, the height of European and American imperialism throughout Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, or the more contemporary neocolonial era, Western governments and firms have sought the global South's oil, minerals, and fertile lands to supply their factories and markets." A bit later, we'll get into how progressive global South governments and popular movement leaders have attempted to fight against and renegotiate this system of resource plunder. But for now, lay out that system. How has the world capitalist system been organized so as to effectively and continuously redistribute wealth and resources from the global South to the global North? How have the basic characteristics of that system remained in place from the dawn of colonialism through the present?
It's a big question, and I'm going to try to answer it concisely, because this really takes us over hundreds of years of world history. But I think that there are a few main points to make. There are different ways to periodize the origins of capitalism. We could talk about, finance in the city-states of Italy. We could look at the capitalist agrarian revolution in England. But I think a really useful way to think about the origins of capitalism are in the conquest of the Americas and are in the systems of mines and plantations that really form the kind of dual economic basis of that hemispheric conquest. And, from that moment onward, from the late 15th century, I mean, if we want to go to the very beginnings, but really kind of increasing over the 1500s, 1600s, all through the early 19th century when Latin American countries became independent, was a system of resource transfer from the mines of Potosi, from the mines of Mexico, for example, to the Spanish Empire. And the Spanish Empire would have been unviable without those mines, as would the origins of industrial capitalism. We weren't in industrial capitalism yet, but once the Industrial Revolution took off in the 19th century in England, and then the kind of second Industrial Revolution, let's say, in the US a little bit later, massive quantities of raw materials of all sorts were in constant demand. And while Latin America had recently become independent, it still had a really peripheral position in the world economy. And in fact, when Latin America became independent from Spain, a lot of Latin American countries, including Chile, got more linked into British capital and British capitalism and that industrial revolutionary process within the British Empire. At the same time, other places on Earth were just starting to be colonized, right? Like when we think about the colonization of the interior of Africa, of North Africa, and of the Middle East, and of South Asia, we look at waves of new forms of resource extraction, appropriation, dispossession happening. I mean, oil is a key example, but there were lots of other natural resources, including agricultural resources, that were harvested or extracted from these regions. And so we have kind of cycles of capitalist history where new territories are getting incorporated into the world system, and in which the mode of linkage between those territories and the broader capitalist economy is the provision of resources and also, of course, the provision of cheapened labor. And this process really continues to today. And just to kind of maybe put a snapshot on it, it is still the case that Global South countries are net providers to the world system of raw materials, of energy, of labor, of embodied land in the final product. And they are the net loser in terms of the monetary surplus of all of those material flows. And so the global north, if we want to use these geographic terms, still appropriates resources from the global south. And so the basic colonial or neocolonial or imperial character of capitalism has not fundamentally changed, even as we see other major changes in the world system, including, of course, ambitions of global south countries to escape that colonial lineage.
One particularly striking example you mention is, quote, on September 12th, 1865, federal cavalry slaughtered at least 31 and as many as 70 Paiute men, women, children, and elders, one of the many such massacres during the years-long genocidal Snake War. And it is atop this bloody landmark that the Thacker Pass mine is sited. And this is not just true in the U.S. Extractive communities all over the world run right through indigenous territory. You write, quote, globally, 69% of energy transition mineral resources or reserves are located within or in close proximity to the lands of indigenous people and or peasant communities. Lithium, in particular, stands out, with 85% of viable resources or reserves in or near the territory of indigenous peoples. And what's really interesting reading your book is that mining doesn't just happen in places like this because that's where the natural resources are. Mining also happens in places like this because the entire history of colonial capitalist modernity, as you were describing just a minute ago, it's all been organized around dispossessing these places and people by making them, rendering them dispossessable. You write, quote, extractive frontiers are history's grooves in the landscape. For corporations and states, these are the paths of least resistance, unless, that is, they become the sites of most resistance. How is it that these grooves get carved, developing these historically thick relationships of domination, dispossession, and then also, of course, contradictorily, resistance. And what particular role do indigenous people play in anti-mining struggles in Chile, across the Americas, and globally?
Yeah, it's so interesting to read these statistics and see that these really large percentages of these so-called critical minerals for the energy transition or for semiconductors and AI or military technology or whatever the kind of end use is, so many of these minerals are sited near indigenous lands. And that should not lead us to believe that like indigenous people just like happen to live near mining deposits, or that there's some like resource determinism at work as to where indigenous people have settled. It is much more because of what you said, which is that colonialism and imperialism are what brought global north states into these areas and encountering indigenous people in the first place. Those areas were then explored for their resource viability, or for, having resources underground, or for having the right type of soil for a plantation of, some other, agricultural commodity. And so a whole set of knowledge, cartographic knowledge, geographical knowledge, knowledge of statecraft was built around this kind of basic map of colonialism. And what that means is that we get this layered history. I referred to this briefly earlier, but I'll say a little bit more now, where we oftentimes in the same exact periphery see, for example, I'll go to Chile, like, in the earlier 19th century, we had the extraction of salt nitrates, of saltpeter from Chile, which was a type of fertilizer. Then that was replaced with synthetic fertilizers, so that kind of went bust. Then we also had waves of silver and gold. Then we had the copper industry. That, is still predominant today. Then layered on top of the copper industry is the lithium industry. And this is all in an area of, the northern reaches of Chile that, again, when the Spanish Empire, Spanish imperial agents first showed up there, they're like, there's nothing here. Why is this even important? They started to learn. And then actually it was the early independent Chilean state and early British capital, as I said, that really kind of dug in there more, pun intended, I guess, and kind of figured out that there was a tremendous amount of resource wealth in that area, and literally built the northern part of Chile as an extractive apparatus. Like ports were built, roads were built, water wells were constructed. All of this was constructed in order to support mining. And in so doing, not only reinforce, but maybe even deepen Chile's peripheral status in the world economy and its status as a provider of natural resources. With all of that history in mind, it's perhaps not surprising that indigenous peoples, in the collective sense, indigenous communities, indigenous movements, have become such important agents of anti-mining protest and articulators, in an intellectual sense, of extractivism and what the harms of extractivism are and what alternative ways of relating to nature might be. But I think it's, just as it's important to not think that the reason we know that the minerals are there are because that's the only place they are. We know because of these long histories of colonialism and imperialism, and that's why there's such a proximity of indigenous communities and these mining deposits. It's also, I don't want to naturalize in any way indigenous protest against mining. It's not at all the case that there's some automatic relationship between the existence of an indigenous community and protest against mining. What we see instead, and Latin America is a very instructive case here and a particularly important one, is that there has been now several decades, starting in the 80s and 90s, of indigenous political mobilization and indigenous peoples gaining rights recognition nationally and internationally for things like prior consent or prior consultation or territorial rights or cultural rights. Those were the results of struggle. But then once you have those rights, even and maybe even especially in their breach, like when they're not respected, that can become a major impetus for protest, because extractive industries violate territorial rights. They often do not ask for any type of consent. And so in those moments, communities are activated because they have a sense of identity, they have a sense of political consciousness, and they have a sense of what their rights should be. And they already have this kind of recent history of mobilization to even be recognized as Indigenous communities as such. And so it's not automatic, nor is it an accident, let's say, that Indigenous communities are often at the forefront of mining resistance. But I maybe should note, just because it applies to a couple of the cases in the book, that there are also other communities that are not Indigenous, but are very land-based or land-dependent. For example, the farmers in northern Portugal, they don't use the same exact language or identity categories as Indigenous people do when they protest mining, but they have been very influenced by Indigenous resistance to mining and to the kind of oppositional stance of anti-extractivism and the kind of revaluation of nature and a desire for a more harmonious relationship between humans and nature, and the tactics of, more militant opposition. And so this repertoire of resistance has really spread from some of its original architects or the original communities that developed it into a broader set of campesino or peasant communities, agricultural communities, other land-based communities, herding communities around the world, in Africa, even in Europe, that also see a completely zero-sum, in their view, relationship between, or conflict between, mining and their livelihoods and cultures.
The anti-colonial revolutions that spread across the colonized world in the mid through late 20th century quickly evolved and coalesced into attempts across the Third World to remake the terms of a neo-colonial global economy. There were two critical and very much interrelated strategies to do so. First, the nationalization of natural resources, and then, at least in the case of oil, states coming together to form an export association, OPEC. There were also proposals from the G77 to remake the entire global economy along the lines of an NIEO, or New International Economic Order. How did third world countries try to confront this reality of unequal exchange through reorganizing markets for primary goods? Why was the OPEC model successful where it was with oil? And then why was that model so hard to replicate for other commodities, other primary goods?
Resource nationalism, nationalizations, the coordination among commodity exporters, the more ambitious proposal for an entirely new international economic order, all of these efforts issued from the same fundamental contradiction, which is that between political sovereignty on the one hand and economic subordination on the other hand. So what decolonized states soon discovered, whether they decolonized in the early 18th century, as was the case in most of Latin America, or into the mid or even late 20th century, if we go to, for example, Africa and other parts of the world, whenever they became free, formally free from colonial subjugation, they discovered that they were not at all free in an economic sense, because their entire economies, as we discussed, had been completely shaped by their peripheral status and by their specific role as being providers of raw materials and cheapened labor for the industrial kind of core economies. And so both radical movements and workers' movements, popular movements, as well as policymakers from actually a variety of ideological perspectives, sought to, once political sovereignty was gained, gain economic sovereignty. And what this looked like was inserting the state and the public sector more proactively into the economy, and maybe a little bit more specifically, capturing from foreign capital the basis of their economies, which, as I just said, was so often in raw materials. And so if raw materials and extractive sectors are what connect you to an unequal global order, then severing that relationship, asserting the public sector over private capital, and asserting the nation over foreign capitalists was a way to really transform the position of these countries in that global system. And we could see these ideas spread, from one world region to another, to maybe different resource sectors. And really, perhaps, as you said, like important outcome of this kind of ferment of ideas was OPEC, which today we would not at all see as a revolutionary actor in any sense, but it was in its origins. I draw a lot on Giuliano Garavini's excellent book, The Rise and Fall of OPEC, among the work of other scholars.
Interviewed here on The Dig.
Yes, to trace out, what made OPEC so revolutionary in its moment, that it was the first time that, in some cases, newly post-colonial states were coming together to assert shared control over what in many ways is the lifeblood of global capitalism, oil, the most important traded commodity that there is. And so, this was a really tall task. I mean, you can read his book to kind of see all the details of it. The Saudi Arabian monarchy getting together with a democratically elected Venezuelan government and all types of regimes in between across multiple languages, religions, etc., to say, we share nothing except one thing. We share the fact that 7 Western multinational oil companies control our economies. And that can't stand anymore in a world in which we are supposed to be emancipated of colonialism. And so they coordinated to establish OPEC and to establish a modicum of control over global oil markets. They also individually, as individual states, nationalized their oil sectors and established state-owned oil companies. And this changed not only the oil market or the economics of oil, it changed global history. It was really the first time that the West had been on the receiving end of a coordinated transnational collective action to reshape the material basis of the global economy. And it's just really important to understand how ambitious it was and how impactful it was in its first couple of decades of existence. It was founded in 1960, but it was really in the early 70s that it reached the height of its political and economic power. Now, this set off a flurry of interest and initiatives to replicate OPEC and other resource sectors. And there's a lot of interesting histories one can learn about, for example, like an attempt at a copper OPEC that was pretty short-lived. But, it turns out that few commodities are like oil, especially, in a moment of ever-growing oil consumption, which was certainly the case then, is unfortunately still the case, though, we are in some sectors replacing oil with other things, as we discussed. But in a moment where oil was seen to kind of be like infinitely growing, and oil and other fossil fuels were like necessary for all aspects of capitalist production, and an oligopoly, like an actual cartel. OPEC was accused of being a cartel before it even really was a cartel, but the cartel in reality were the 7 sisters, the 7 major oil companies that did coordinate their pricing and contractual structures. And so you have a single commodity demanded everywhere in the world. That's, a major element of all global trade. You have just 7 companies that dominate production, and you have several global South countries that are the main producers of oil. And that reduced some of the coordination dilemmas. It meant that these countries experienced really similar harms and injustices by the same set of oil companies, even though, again, they were different in so many other ways. They shared the same relationship to these oil companies, which created a lot of incentive to rewrite that relationship together. And it turned out to be much harder to do this in smaller or more fragmented markets, or markets that were less oligopolistic or concentrated, or markets that provided a commodity that was not as essential to oil to the everyday functioning of capitalism.
Latin America was the birthplace and really continues to be the vital center of resource nationalist politics. Resource nationalism continuously plays such a key role in the region's left-wing social movements, political parties, governments. What specifically is the Chilean story here? What role did copper nationalization play in Salvador Allende's popular unity government? What role did it play in Pinochet's U.S.-backed coup overthrowing him? And how have those struggles shaped the contemporary political economy of lithium mining in Chile?
Latin America is really the birthplace of resource nationalism. And one of the things I discovered in writing this book is that it was Latin American countries, Argentina, Mexico, Bolivia, to name three, that implemented the first cases of nationalization, of expropriation of resource wealth, or establishing state-owned companies and nationalizing the sector outside of the revolutionary context of the Soviet Union. So really, resource nationalism begins in Latin America and has a recurrent cyclical history in the region that is very relevant today as well. In that century-long story, Chile is up there, among the top of like a really interesting case to understand these different forms of resource governance and how and why resource sectors got so politicized in Latin America and what the different policy paradigms have been. So Chile, like the rest of Latin America, becomes liberated from Spanish rule in the early 19th century. And it's in that moment that the contradiction and conundrum that I mentioned before begins. Chile is formally free, and it's pretty free of like the Spanish Empire, but now it's being subjugated by the British Empire and British capitalists. And so it is economically subordinated, even though politically free. And so that birthed a lot of interest over the next century and more among Chilean social movements, political movements, left-wing movements, Chilean heterodox economic thinkers, etc., in how to break this dependency and how to actually reclaim economic sovereignty over the Chilean economy. This process really reached its apotheosis under the democratically elected socialist government of Allende in the early 70s. He was building on some prior kind of progressive nationalist administrations that had started the process of nationalizing copper, but weren't necessarily going to take it the full way. And what Allende did was complete the process in a particularly dramatic form. He nationalized all of the major copper mines in Chile, all of which were by this point owned by American capitalists, because now the U.S. is like the regional hegemon at this point, kind of displacing the British Empire. And so he expropriated American multinational-owned copper assets, and he didn't compensate them, which was like adding insult to injury, because he said they had profited so much that, they should be paying Chile in terms of like extra profits versus Chile compensating them for the nationalization. This was an enormous affront to American empire, really, and to the Nixon administration in particular, and these very powerful copper companies that were influential in the White House. And this is really when the U.S. government decided, in the Cold War context that we were in at the time, that the Allende government was a huge problem for them. And in a variety of ways that many other historians have detailed, they helped, according to declassified documents that we know about now, the CIA played an important role in helping foment the coup that Pinochet then used to grab power and depose the Allende government. And so what Pinochet did once he was in power was very interesting, because we might think Pinochet, he's a neoliberal, he's like a classic free market guy, he's very brutal, he uses the state to repress people, but he wants to like free the market entirely. And the situation is a little more nuanced with extractive sectors, which is a clue to that extractive sectors in general involve more state intervention than other sectors of the economy. And so rather than revert the nationalized mines to private ownership, privatize them in other words, he actually kept them under public ownership and even established the state-owned company that now manages all that, starting at that point, then started to manage all the mines, Codelco. And so the state-owned copper company of Chile, that's sort of famous as a state-owned company, was actually created by this neoliberal dictator. And that's for a number of reasons. There were nationalist wings of the military that wanted to retain control over the strategic resource, but also copper was just important in funding the military and funding the state writ large. And so he maintains those mines as public, but simultaneously begins to court a lot of new private investment. And so in a weird way, Pinochet is both the origins of the state-owned mining company Codelco, but he's also the origins of like the smaller and smaller role of Codelco in the Chilean copper industry in general, because more and more private companies are moving in and having partnerships with Codelco or developing their own mines. And so Pinochet really changes the orientation of resource policy in Chile. For Allende, nationalizing resources wasn't just about providing an economic basis for his socialist project. It wasn't even just about economic sovereignty and changing Chile's relationship to the rest of the world system. It was also about what he called dignity, which is the fact that the rapacious predation of multinational capital getting into the very bowels and crust of Chile and extracting these resources and leaving Chile with very little as a result was an affront to Chilean dignity, and that the only way to reclaim dignity in its material sense and in its spiritual sense was to bring these mines into the public sector. For Pinochet, it was very different. The mines were important to him because they were a strategic resource that he viewed in national security terms, and because they were a potential site of a lot of profitable foreign direct investment in Chile. And so he changed the mining sector and made it much more open to global industry. And decades have followed since, but to this day, I would say Chilean movements, Chilean left-wing political forces, and of course the current left-wing president of Chile are still in so many ways trying to undo Pinochet's legacy, undo all the courting of foreign capital that has marked the economic development model in Chile, and the absence of the state in terms of regulation and welfare provision that has accompanied that.
And the Pinochet dictatorship also really profoundly shapes the lithium industry, because it's due to the Pinochet regime that these two companies that control all of Chile's lithium concessions, SQM and Albemarle, it's due to the Pinochet regime that they control those concessions.
Yeah, these two companies kind of got a lucky break in a way, and it's interesting. And I won't get into all the details. People can read the book, but I'll just say a couple of things. I think it's worth noting, just because both Albemarle and SQM are, again, two of the world's largest lithium companies. They're quite important in the world of lithium. And both of them got their start under Pinochet. And both of them benefited from starting out, or in Albemarle's case, the kind of company, a prior company, Foot Minerals, that it bought the assets of, but that's a whole, history of mergers and acquisitions. But regardless, both of the kind of mineral concessions or claims that these mining companies use as the legal foundation of their mines happened in a really interesting window, which was after the Pinochet coup and dictatorship had started, but before that same Pinochet government declared lithium to be a strategic resource that then meant you had to work through lots of layers of state licensing, and it was actually became complicated to open an entirely new lithium mine in Chile, because due to the Cold War and lithium's role in nuclear weaponry, he wanted to reserve this sector as one linked more to the national security apparatus in Chile and guard it against forms of investment that might be contrary to the state's interests. But there was a window before he made this claim that lithium is essential to Chile's national security, in which he was courting foreign capital. And so that's how the company that then became Albemarle's made its way in there. And those company officials were thrilled that there was a dictatorship. And they, I have some interesting archival material in the book around how they were there's been a change in the political climate, which is going to allow us to finally develop this mine, right? Very euphemistic word for what was actually happening. And in the case of SQM, it was even more direct, because SQM was actually a state-owned company, a Chilean state-owned company. As we learn the history of mid-century Chile, there was a lot of state-owned companies and intervention in these sectors, and it was then privatized by Pinochet, kind of near the end of his regime, and given in a very, speak of Nepo babies, in a very corrupt move to his son-in-law, who then, made SQM into the lithium mining powerhouse that it is today. And so we wouldn't really have Chile as a top lithium producer, most likely, without, what Pinochet did to really set up the sector and specifically set up this kind of duopoly of these two companies that dominate the sector to today.
You write, quote, "Resource extraction everywhere and always takes place against a background of public policies. Whether governments act independently of oil and mining companies is another question altogether, but in no other sector of the economy is the state so central. And your book gets into this a lot. I mean, lithium mining in Nevada and really all hard rock mining on federal land in the United States is governed by an extraordinarily permissive 1872 mining law, a law passed at the very height, not coincidentally, at the very height of genocidal ethnic cleansing during the westward expansion of white settler colonialism. Chile's mining industry, we were just talking about this, was indelibly shaped by both Spanish colonialism and, again, by the Pinochet dictatorship. Why is it that consistently and everywhere the state is so front and center in this economic sector, more so than any other?
I think that this really goes back to our point about how resources are in specific territories. Those territories are controlled by states. In many global South states, the state itself is the owner of all subsoil resources, like legally. And so in order for a resource firm to extract those resources, they have to directly negotiate with the state to gain access, whether it's a concession, whether it's a lease, a joint venture. There's all different juridical forms that this can take. But whatever form it takes, the company can't simply show up and start extracting the resources without some type of interaction with the state. Even where, as it is in the kind of more Anglo-American or even European worlds where maybe the state doesn't technically own the resources, so you don't have to necessarily negotiate with them for the contract, there are still a number of permits and licenses that need to be obtained in order to extract at all. All of this can be a sometimes long-term bureaucratic process of getting all of your paperwork in order. And I would say that in no other sector is the state as fundamental to mediating capital accumulation. And that does not necessarily mean that the state is in charge or powerful or fully kind of in the driver's seat, so to speak, but it does mean that mining is not going to happen except mediated through state power in some way. And that is itself, in maybe an ironic sense, the reason that mining companies are often so intent on infiltrating the state, on doing what we call regulatory capture, because those state institutions are so essential. But in many contexts, especially but not exclusively post-colonial contexts, the state may lack administrative capacity. These institutions are essential, but they're also weak and malleable and porous. And, the lobbying arm of multinational corporations and their teams of lawyers are very well equipped to kind of work their way into the state, even to work their way into, legislative institutions or of decision-making and lawmaking in order to bend laws to be more profitable for them or less, quote unquote, overreaching in their regulation, or whether to pay off officials to quiet any potential concern at the local level, or whether to kind of coerce countries into really bad deals in terms of the basic contracts and royalty and taxation schemes. But what this also means is that the state itself is a terrain of political contestation over mining. Because the state is important, even if often weakened or not playing its full kind of regulatory potential, communities and also good faith bureaucrats and state actors and political parties and other movements see the state as an arena in which they can contest this extractive model of development and reshape it. And so for both industry interests as well as efforts at reform and transformation, you can't understand resource extraction without looking at the specific state agencies and bureaucratic processes and contract negotiations that make extraction into an economic reality.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Black History is for Everyone by Brian Jones. A longtime educator explores how the study of Black history challenges our understanding of race, nation, and the stories we tell about who we are. As Ashley D. Farmer puts it, with searing honesty and incisive prose, Black History is for Everyone offers a sweeping journey through more than 3 centuries of Black history. Brian Jones masterfully blends personal reflection with powerful storytelling, revealing the centrality of Black history to American life. Urgent, eye-opening, and deeply engaging, this is essential reading for students, educators, and anyone ready to see the past and the present with fresh eyes. Find Black History is for Everyone at haymarketbooks.org, where all hardcover books are 10% off every day. A central contradiction of your book, as you laid it out at the top of the interview, is that, quote, everywhere that mines are dug up to provide raw materials for the energy transition, global climate action comes into conflict with local environmental protection. And the dilemma is that confronting the inarguably urgent existential threat posed by climate change requires this harmful mining. But you and your colleagues at the Climate and Community Institute have challenged the terms of that trade-off in a study called More Mobility, Less Mining, which found that we could use way less lithium if society, for example, built out public transit instead of replacing the internal combustion vehicle in every American garage with an EV. You mentioned earlier how much projected mining would be required for the energy transition under the present organization of society. What could things look like instead if government remade society, particularly transportation, along more enlightened lines? And then, why isn't this the way that mainstream environmentalists and mainstream center-left government climate policy has approached the energy transition?
When I first started looking into forecasting for future demand, it was immediately clear that every forecasting agency, from the International Energy Agency to the World Bank to the US government to private commodity analytics firms, were forecasting enormous increases in how much mining would be needed in order to furnish the inputs for the energy transition. But there was also a more specific thing. If you looked a little more closely at the different curves and lines on these graphs, which is that the more ambitious our climate policies, the more mining would be needed. So that felt like it really put a point on the fact that there maybe is just a zero-sum trade-off between ambitious, urgent, fast, holistic climate policies on the one hand, and on the other hand, the protection of ecosystems and communities and water systems from mining, that these were just like fundamentally opposed goals. But that didn't really sit well with me, just in terms of my own politics and values. I would not like it to be the case that the more ambitious we are about climate action, the more large-scale extraction we necessarily need. And I, over time, started to think, like, what are these models exactly assuming about how we're going to go about the energy transition? And what I learned is that their baseline assumption was replicating at scale the exact model of consumption that affluent Americans and, maybe affluent people in much of the world take for granted. Single family homes, individual cars, sprawl and highways between those things, all matter of other instant gratification consumption, ordering our things from Amazon. None of that would change. except that the underlying energy powering it all would change, and that also some of the guts of the system would have to change. So instead of an internal combustion engine, we have a lithium battery, but we still have a hulking SUV. It's just powered with a battery. And we still have to drive far distances to get to school or work. It's just that we're not putting carbon emissions in the atmosphere while we do so. And I started to think, like, well, what if we change some of those facts on the ground? Like, what if more Americans took buses? Or what if there was slightly more density to our metropolitan regions? Or what if the cars weren't quite so big? And, I started looking for research that would show that we get really different volumes of mineral demand with these types of changes. None of which, by the way, like, abolish capitalism. They just like make us more like Western Europe or like East Asia in our like patterns of consumption, right? So they're not even like as radical as they might sound. They're just kind of different from the kind of American, classically American way of life, let's say. But anyway, I started to wonder this. And what I discovered immediately is that no one had asked this question, or there was no research on it, which itself shows the power of like the ideology of the automobile. And I think Andre Gortz has an amazing, the same guy who has the idea of non-reformist reforms, has this beautiful essay on the kind of ideological power of automobility in the US and elsewhere. And so this ideological constraint operated to even preclude the question of like, could we make these kind of changes to the built environment and to mobility and how we get around in order to maybe not need quite as much lithium? Anyway, years went by after this question first occurred to me, and then I started working with a think tank, the Climate and Community Institute, and got together a team of researchers who have the actual modeling and technical and quantitative skills that I sorely lack. And we got our minds together and we designed a completely novel model of mineral demand, or it was novel in the questions that it asked and the parameters that we put into the model. It didn't do anything unconventional in terms of the basic modeling techniques. So, we're not cooking the books in any way or doing something weird with the number crunching. It's more like, let's ask the question. If the batteries are smaller, what happens? If the distances are shorter because there's less sprawl, what happens? If 10% more people take the bus or bike, etc., what happens? And what we discovered is that a lot happens, and that we could really radically reduce how much mining we'll need in the future. The worst to best case scenarios are actually pretty far apart from one another. A scenario in which we do nothing to, reduce how much people drive, but instead double down on current patterns of driving, on large cars, on sprawl, we don't recycle any batteries, etc., will require much more lithium than implementing a host of changes of denser neighborhoods, more mobility options, more recycling of batteries, and smaller batteries. We would need, upwards of 60% less lithium in the future, between now and 2050, if we implement these changes. And in the final year that we modeled in 2050, there was a 92% reduction in how much mining would be needed, the worst case and best case scenarios compared. That's a really dramatic outcome. What I want to say, just to not confuse anybody, is more lithium mining will still be needed. And this is why this is such a difficult question for the left. But it's just that we won't need as much as the most alarming forecast suggests if we make some headway on changing our way of getting around and changing our built environment and starting up a bunch of battery recycling. And so the question is, like, why is the climate movement not focused on this? They are focusing on it more now, and that's great. And that's in some small part due to what we've done at Climate and Community Institute, but also lots of other groups that have started to think about how do we reduce demand for mining, given its environmental impacts and the geopolitical conflicts that it's also embroiled in. I think one maybe easy but correct answer is just that for a long time, climate activists saw the world of energy in very black and white terms. Like, either we have a fossil fuel-based energy system or we're in the wonderful world of renewable energy. And they didn't always kind of break open the black box of like, well, are there different ways to design a renewable energy system? Are there different paths towards zero emissions? And then I think also sometimes there is a self-moderation or reluctance to tackle what seem like really hard things to change, like the American love affair with driving. Like, we can change it to an electric vehicle. That's hard enough. Why should we try to also change, people taking buses or bikes or walking instead of cars, that it's just making the task too difficult. And I think that's like a real concern to have, but I think it also misses the fact that getting Americans to buy EVs is also really hard. Like, all of this is really hard. Why not try to do it in the best way possible, both for our climate goals, people taking buses more, living in denser neighborhoods, all of that is better for the climate crisis, as well as for our goals of hopefully not ripping up, every landscape on Earth for lithium or cobalt or nickel mine.
And it's also just a better way to live.
It's a better way to live that involves lots of co-benefits, like fewer people dying in car accidents in the US, right? By the way, cars are made more deadly when they're really huge and have really heavy batteries. So each of these brings other benefits, each of the interventions.
More time reading a book on a subway train rather than stuck in traffic. I mean, we could go on and on and on.
Yeah, and there's, I think, a housing crisis. So building more affordable density in our sort of urban core and metropolitan regions is really important on its own merits, just to solve the housing crisis. But also, as I said, would mean that people don't have to own cars as much, and would mean that they will probably take other modes of transportation.
You obviously disagree with a grouping known as the eco-modernists, who insist that there are sufficient minerals to do the transition without reducing demand, with no apparent regard for the harms of mining, and people who tend to more generally argue that the climate crisis can be overcome first and foremost through technological innovation and just the Promethean will of humankind. But you're also not sold entirely, I don't think, on degrowth as the frame, even though in many ways you basically agree with its agenda. What different ways are there of thinking about the energy transition in the realm of the capital D discourse? And how would you articulate what I think could perhaps best be described as your Green New Deal vision for the energy transition?
Yeah. So just to address the degrowth, maybe spicy comment first. And as you put it, I don't disagree with what I take to be much of the policy content of degrowth, or even some of its like more empirical analyses of, how unsustainable current volumes of material demand are for the planet, how much the capitalist economy requires of resources, how much it dumps at the end of that, treating the earth as a landfill, how many planetary boundaries have been transgressed or breached in the process, and that a system of more sustainable and equitable consumption would bring many benefits. And I think especially the degrowth analyses that really look at the class structure of consumption and how affluent people are over consumers and actually, working class and poor people are under consuming, right? So I think a more nuanced form of degrowth takes class seriously. The prescription is not austerity, especially not for, working class people, but maybe we need austerity for the rich or something like that. We need to, ban private jets or just ban electric Hummers. Like, those shouldn't even exist as an option. And so I have a lot of empathy with degrowth. I think what the concern that I raise, and maybe this comes from like a US context in particular, is just whether the language of degrowth is a useful starting point for political organizing. But I think insofar as the actual organizers in concrete context are flexible, that, is not per se, a reason to throw out the whole set of ideas. And so I see a lot of comradeship and kind of affinity between a lot of what I'm arguing and some of the main insights of degrowth. There have been huge and interesting debates over the past several years around ideas like a just transition, a Green New Deal. More recently, an idea that Climate and Community Institute, the same think tank that I mentioned before, has been cultivating is the idea of green economic populism. That's a way to kind of lean into the Green New Deal paradigm, but maybe update it for the current moment in which people are feeling a really intense cost of living crisis, in which, due to AI and the data center boom, among other reasons, we're seeing electricity rates go up, utility bills go up. There's a housing crisis, as I've already mentioned. Cars are themselves increasingly expensive for working class people. Food is getting more expensive, not unrelated to climate change. So in general, there's a lot of different cost shocks that households are being forced to absorb, and that itself is becoming grist for populism, left and right, but a lot of left-wing populism recently in the political domain. So the question is, like, how do we green that populism, right? Which I think, again, takes inspiration from the Green New Deal insight that there's a connection between the climate crisis on the one hand and the crisis of socioeconomic inequality on the other hand, but it sharpens it to the most intense ways in which that crisis is manifesting at the so-called kitchen table of households across America. And it does so by, first of all, specifying that the climate crisis is itself a source of cost shocks in energy and food in particular, but also that the way we address the climate crisis has to address the cost of living crisis, or else it's on the one hand not going to be politically viable, and on the other hand going to reinforce the very predatory class structures that are themselves part of the cause of the climate crisis and the crisis of overconsumption and environmental harm that I just discussed, overconsumption of elites, I mean. And so if we want to tackle climate change, we also have to tackle the really unequal allocation of resources like energy and food and the natural resources that produce all of our goods. And green economic populism, we can see it in Zoran's campaign in many ways. You know, fast and free buses, it's economically populist because they're free and fast and get working class people to work in where they need to go. But it's also green because even if it's a traditional bus, of course, if it's an electric bus, but even if it's a traditional bus, it is a less carbon intensive way for people to get around than individual automobiles. And so we could look at this in the energy system. We could look at this in agriculture. We could look at this in housing. And with each of those, there are interventions that are simultaneously green and populist. And I don't think the climate movement has a future in the US, I mean, just to put it really bluntly, without thinking about how to build popular support for policies that in many ways will be difficult and costly. But the question is, who bears those costs? And how do we pay for it? And we shouldn't shy away from that, but we should be really clear that working class people that are already the victims of climate change and not mainly the culprits behind it for the most part, especially globally, but even in the US, compared to more elite people or compared to wealthy corporations or the politicians that do their bidding, we can structure an equitable way to pay for these costs and to protect people from the ravages of climate change as well as from economic shocks in the meantime.
China exercises substantial direct or indirect control over lithium and other critical minerals in the battery and EV supply chain, from the extractive frontier to the final product, that final product being, say, an adorable BYD Dolphin Surf, which you can't really buy in the United States. Anyhow, you write, quote, China's EV market is the direct result of industrial policies that have encouraged mass production and consumption. Market fundamentals, supply and demand, were effectively artifacts of government planning. How did China build its dreams and develop an EV sector that took off in the spectacular way that it did with such sophisticated technology and industrial capacity? And how did they go about securing these supply chains that they needed to do it?
The Chinese Communist Party really, over decades has been an expert at market craft, which I think is like an interesting sentence to even say, just because we might associate, a communist party with a party that is like hostile to creating markets. And yet we have, I think, some of the most advanced markets in the world, as well as systems of production to supply those markets in China for many of these cutting edge technologies, top among them the technologies that we need to transition away from fossil fuels. And on every end of this, as I say in the quote that you mentioned, Chinese policymakers used industrial policy and regulatory policy and capital controls and financial policy to construct the supply, to construct the demand, and to help those connect in exchange. And, this really started we could go to different origin points, but I'll just say it kind of started in the 1980s. That's the origins of the Chinese auto sector. That's before it's the auto sector is electrified. But at that moment, there was more and more car imports into China, especially the more elite members of the CCP were well enough off to afford foreign cars. That created a trade deficit that concerned the CCP. And so they started the process of creating a domestic auto industry. This happened through joint ventures with foreign multinationals, and that required those multinational firms to transfer technology and also to procure the content of their cars, all of the inputs of the car locally. So that's a kind of made in China, local content requirements. And so this joint venture made in China set of policies started in the auto industry, but then got replicated across the rest of the Chinese economy in ways that we're probably familiar with. So that created a huge auto sector, or the beginnings of it. But there was a concomitant or simultaneous problem, which was pollution in China. And that had become a political problem. There was also the fact that the traditional car sector was pretty saturated. So, China could create a domestic auto sector, but it wasn't likely to become an exporting powerhouse because Japan and Germany and the US really dominated the traditional car market. And so in order to quell protest over pollution, a lot of which was due to transportation, though not exclusively, and also to find an economic niche in which China could really become an exporting powerhouse, there was an increasing emphasis on electric vehicles. But that created a difficulty because China could manufacture electric vehicles in China, but all of the batteries were manufactured in Japan, which made China vulnerable to Japan and dependent on Japan. And so over time, and this was the example that you gave of BYD, the founder of BYD, Wang Chuanfo, actually, in an amazing feat, reversed engineered Japanese cell phone batteries, not really getting the technology from Japan or not technological transfer, but just kind of taking them apart, reverse engineering them, and realizing that they could replace expensive Japanese automation with cheaper Chinese labor. And so that was kind of the origins of BYD, one of the largest manufacturers of EVs and batteries in the world. But it was against this backdrop of the Chinese state promoting the auto sector, promoting EVs in particular, doing all of these interesting public policies that we don't do in the US, like having a competition between major Chinese cities as to who could deploy EVs the fastest. There were also a lot of state help in setting up the basics of manufacturing for the BYD empire, including that BYD is based in Shenzhen, which is one of 4 special economic zones, which are areas that are designated and sort of deregulated in certain ways and therefore easier to invest in and more profitable. And then there's a whole parallel set of processes to stimulate consumption. So there was a lot of subsidies and rebates for buying electric vehicles. Those actually started to be phased out because now the EV industry is so competitive that you can get a $5,000 EV in China and you don't necessarily need a rebate. There were other things that made it easier to own an EV versus a traditional car, easier to get a permit for your car or whatever it was. So they really put a lot of state muscle behind the production and the consumption. And then the third piece is the extraction. China is, blessed, if we want to use that word, but definitely has a lot of lithium resources internally and has a long history of lithium mining for other purposes. So there's a starting point domestically, but it's actually not enough at all to satisfy the demand for lithium, which is enormous. China's the top consumer of lithium, 80% of lithium battery manufacturing in the world. And so Chinese companies both innovated domestic extraction and downstream companies, including BYD, directly invested in the upstream of mining, but they also went outside into the world. And some of the top lithium companies are Chinese, like Ganfeng or Tianqi, and they invest in assets in Latin America and Australia. So they get assets abroad for lithium and also domestically. And the Chinese state has been important in helping all of that. But at this point, you have just profit-oriented Chinese firms that are just really effective at acquiring lithium, at mining it, and at feeding it into Chinese supply chains for electromobility.
The era of free trade globalization that defined the world order from the fall of the Soviet Union through the Obama presidency has decidedly ended. And the fight for control over energy transition supply chains, over market share and green tech, and China's ascendancy on all of these counts, that is a big part of the story. Particularly since the pandemic, the overriding principles have been domestic industrial policy, mercantilism, and geoeconomics. In the U.S., for both Biden and Trump, economic policy became synonymous with national security policy, particularly oriented towards countering or even defeating China. For Biden, with the Inflation Reduction Act, it was also a means to spur the energy transition, certainly not Trump's motivation, which we'll get to more in a minute. There have also been similar trends in Europe. Europe is specifically concerned about distinguishing itself as the home of ethical green energy and ethical EVs. Countries everywhere in the world, of course, have to respond to these new rules governing the world order. Why did the free trade order get supplanted by geoeconomics? How and when it did? What role did the energy transition play causally in this tectonic shift? And then what implications, in turn, does the new emerging geoeconomic order have for the political economy of the energy transition?
There are different ways to periodize the origin of the death of free trade or neoliberal globalization. Maybe an unexpected one would be to go back to 2008, during which something we will immediately think of was happening, which was the financial crisis. And certainly that itself played a role in delegitimizing neoliberal globalization and financial deregulation and free flows of capital and that sort of thing. But there was another thing happening in 2008 that was supremely relevant to the geoeconomic turn that elapsed a bit later, which is there was a major commodity boom at that moment. That was a moment where primary commodities like oil and copper and beef and soy all had record high prices. And the reason for that was China's rapid industrialization. So while the West was mired in financial crisis and the neoliberal playbook it had sold the world, if we want to be simplistic, was delegitimized, China was rapidly rising in its industrialization, therefore demanding all of these inputs and raw materials to feed the machines and also Chinese consumers, and therefore putting upward pressure on prices for all of those commodities, which provided for an economic boom and a massive expansion of mining in Latin America, subject of my book Resource Radicals, but more proximate to our concerns here, started to concern Western policymakers, because for the first time since the 1970s, since that moment of OPEC and nationalizations that we talked about earlier, Western policymakers and corporate CEOs began to worry about their access to cheap raw materials, which was like an essential precondition of the kind of consumer capitalism that prevails. And so, some little known bureaucrats in the corners of whatever agencies in the European Union and American federal state started to pen these reports like, this is a major vulnerability. Like, raw materials might just become more expensive. Also, China is like directly threatening Western economic primacy. How are we going to access the raw materials we need? Some of these raw materials, they also said, are particularly important. They call them critical minerals. Critical minerals are minerals that are considered essential to the economy, but also to national security, and where there's a concern about supply and reliable supply. And so they started to say, like, we need to think about the supply chains, especially for 21st century technologies. We need to think that they start in mining. We need to counter the fact that China is gobbling up all the minerals of the world. And one way to deal with that is to mine at home. And so this 2008 to 2010 moment is the origins of what is now a policy reality of onshoring supply chains in the global north, and even encouraging lots of new mining projects within the global north. in between 2008 and the present are a variety of processes that kind of all moved us in this direction, right? So we have the pandemic and concern about vulnerable supply chains, including for PPE and pharmaceuticals and other types of things that were essential in that moment. But anyway, we have the pandemic. We have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which created an enormous shock in the energy system. And then we have the energy transition itself, requiring all of these new supply chains, but also increasingly being linked as a domain of geostrategic importance, that the energy transition was going to determine who the new power players were. Like if the countries that controlled oil were the important players of the fossil capitalist era, the countries that control new energy transition supply chains are going to be the power players of the next era. And China was already, because of the processes we talked about with electric vehicles, like light years ahead. And there's a parallel set of processes of China in solar panel production, in which it was, again, really ahead of the West in mass scale production and in cheapening the process of producing solar panels. And so these ideas from the early 2008, early 2010s started to finally have their political opening. First under Trump, interestingly, someone not interested in energy transition, but definitely interested in geopolitical dominance. And so under Trump's first government, he calls lithium a critical mineral for the first time. It gets added to the US catalog of critical minerals. He fast tracks some lithium mines that today are under construction. And he kind of opens up this arena of policymaking. But it was really Biden that built on Trump's legacy of anti-China hawkishness and of this dominance approach to geopolitics, but linked it much more concertedly to the energy transition. And it was in that moment that a lot of climate experts and advocates either bought the Faustian bargain or became convinced that this melding of national security and energy transition was going to be good for climate politics, that it was going to accelerate climate politics. Out of this, we, of course, have the U.S.'s only major climate and energy legislation to date, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is now being dismantled by Trump, but which really incentivized onshoring by saying that over time, if you wanted to get the tax credit if you were producing EVs, or you wanted to get the consumer credit if you were purchasing them, there needed to be increasing levels of domestic content, including critical minerals, right? And then at the same time, barriers to trade were being erected so that we wouldn't even import Chinese lithium batteries or Chinese lithium or Chinese electric vehicles.
And critical minerals being just minerals that are deemed critical from a geoeconomic perspective, essentially.
Exactly. And so we have this kind of policy momentum and bipartisan and transatlantic consensus. The Trump and Biden agree we should have more lithium mining in the U.S. They may disagree about what to do with that lithium. On the other end, Trump, doesn't like electric vehicles, but he does like lithium mining. And so Trump and Biden agree on critical minerals. A lot of the policy establishment agrees that we need more mining at home. In Europe, a place where there has been even less mining in recent history, there is also an effort to bring more mining of these critical minerals into Europe. And so, it does raise an interesting question, why would the West want to mine more domestically? Because mining is toxic, contentious, conflictual. It's a very volatile boom and bust sector. It's a lot easier to just have it out of sight, out of mind, to offshore it, which is exactly what both classical imperialism, but also neoliberal globalization had done, which is make it so that mining happens in some places in the world and then high-end manufacturing and technological innovation happen in other places. And now those are being brought together more. That shouldn't trick us into thinking that there's less mining in the global south. There's just more mining all around because the demand is growing, but is absolutely redrawing the map of critical minerals mining. And now there are multiple projects underway in the US, in Europe, and those are not shockingly causing similar types of protests as they do in Latin America. And so this is not uncontested, but it is, the new geoeconomics of the energy transition has a history that we could even trace to the 1970s in terms of the idea that onshoring is a way to deal with geopolitical uncertainty around critical materials in the economy. In that moment, it was, okay, OPEC wants to raise prices for oil, we're going to extract more oil in Alaska or in the Gulf of Mexico or in the North Seas of the United Kingdom to have a kind of more local source of this energy that doesn't rely on these unreliable governments, right? And now it's a really similar logic, but instead of oil, it's we need more lithium, more copper, more rare earths closer to home because we can't rely on China or these global South governments who are now trying to nationalize things as well. And so we see a little repetition of that history, but very much updated to the most advanced technological frontiers and most important economic sectors of our moment.
And car companies, interestingly, are operating on a very similar logic to global North states. Whereas global North states are onshoring and friendshoring, car companies are, after decades of vertical disintegration, are vertically reintegrating. In the case of GM, they're securing direct stakes in Lithium Americas and exclusive access to portions of that mine's lithium, that mine being the Thacker Pass mine in Nevada.
Yeah, no one trusts free trade or global markets anymore in the same way that they used to. And so while states are securitizing, states in the global north are securitizing supply chains, kind of melding national security politics with economic policy, onshoring and reshoring mining, corporations headquartered in those same states are saying, we don't just trust that we can get lithium when we want it. Like all of this geopolitical turbulence, which is like cause and consequence of this global north securitization, also means that like if one day the US and China are at war, or, you know, maybe even put a finer point on it, like China does export controls, or Chile does export controls, or Zimbabwe. I mean, and export controls are a tool in the toolkit of global South resource nationalism. Like, we're not going to be able to get the lithium that we need, right? And so they're kind of going back to what Henry Ford's, ideas were that became known as then Fordism, that there should be vertical integration, which then neoliberal globalization sliced and diced those supply chains. What Henry Ford had tried to do and did do in many ways was say, like, the same company should own the raw materials as the factories and the whole kind of supply chain of production. Neoliberalism fragmented that, and we had offshoring and outsourcing, which in some ways, in a neoclassical economics perspective, is more quote unquote economically efficient than the same company doing everything. Now there's this kind of return to Fordism. And so we have companies downstream, battery companies and electric vehicle companies, investing directly in mines or directly negotiating with mining companies to have 20-year contracts for lithium. And so this kind of introduces, a bit more, we could say, rigidity in the sense that particular mines might be linked to particular car companies, which then stakes the reputation and also the, economic production and business model of those car companies on those particular mines. So there are some vulnerabilities and risks there, but those risks are more palatable than the idea that you might be cut off from supply altogether.
Risks, but also points of leverage for people organizing up and down supply chains.
Absolutely.
You gestured toward this earlier, but Trump is doubling down really dramatically on state intervention in U.S. industry, making dramatic, unusual moves to take direct government ownership stakes in 3 critical minerals companies. MP Americas, which operates a rare earths mine in California, and note how China just basically called the U.S.'s bluff and forced Trump to entirely back down due to their export controls on critical minerals. Then Lithium Americas, which is constructing the lithium mine in Thacker Pass, Nevada, as I mentioned before, and Trilogy Metals, which has a major copper project in Alaska. But Trump, of course, very much opposes the very energy transition that's driving demand for all of these minerals. Indeed, he is gutting the IRA. This is really, at least at first blush, really hard to make sense of. Why is Trump orchestrating these groundbreaking levels of state economic intervention in order to control key inputs to an energy transition that he wants to destroy? You write, quote, "In U.S. politics, the critical minerals consensus has proven more durable than climate action." Why is that?
I think that's because critical minerals have so many different end uses and can be linked to so many different economic and political projects. Liberals might see in critical minerals a possibility of like a homegrown energy transition that doesn't rely on an autocratic China and like uses US ingenuity and innovation to kind of build the green future, but also has this basis of raw material security as a foundation. But the justification for the mining is the energy transition, right? And or like competing with China, which liberals are, of course, very invested in doing, or at least the liberal establishment. I don't know about ordinary liberal voters. For Trump, you can take the same minerals and justify their necessity in totally different ways. They are necessary for the semiconductor and computational and energy storage like hardware of a data center, which is then linked to his favorite industries of artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency and all of these things, right? And the big tech like oligarchy that he's increasingly aligned with. That whole world and that all of those economic sectors also need critical minerals. So does, of course, military technology. It is definitely the case that energy transition technologies, whether wind turbines or solar panels or electric vehicles, account for more of the demand for mining of these critical minerals than currently, at least, like AI or military tech does. But this is about justification. It's about like, what do you say and what is your message to the public, but also to Wall Street and investors and corporate C-suites as to why you are intervening to make mining easier in the West. And minerals can be used to make all sorts of things. And Trump has no problem with mining. In fact, the extractive sector is a really important part of the typical Republican, the GOP coalition, right? And so he is friendly to mining companies. He just is not friendly to the end use that happens to account for most of their demand. So it is ultimately contradictory as an industrial policy. But I do want to emphasize that it also is the most muscular form of like direct state intervention into ownership in mining that we've had like maybe ever in the US. It's not just more interventionist than what Biden was doing. Biden did tax credits and subsidies for mining companies and low interest loans. Trump's directing agencies like the Pentagon and the Department of Energy to literally be partial owners of mines. That is like a higher level of state intervention. And I think the left should think about this. Like, would we use that, but for good? Like, is there a different way that we would propose, like, the public owned resources? I think it really shifts the Overton window in ways that could be useful to us in the future. But in the immediate term, it's very concerning because what Trump's moves are basically doing is inflating the values of the shares of these companies, which is a way to crowd in private finance. This is a classic de-risking move. So rather than state ownership being contrary to private ownership, it's actually facilitating it and increasing its value. And he's also doing so with very few guardrails in terms of like how these resources are used, of course, the governance or regulation that monitors like their environmental impacts. And so this is a very bad form of resource nationalism, but it does draw on the toolkit of resource nationalism that, in many ways has been innovated by global South states, but here we see it, right in the global North.
It's interesting, though, the intervention, the direct government stake in these mining companies is unprecedented. It really does echo so much of what Trump has done in terms of intervening in the market to send share prices through the roof. His policies have done the same for all the big tech companies, big time around AI, and he's done it with crypto, and he's done it with the entire stock market. Another central dilemma that your book addresses is a dilemma that confronts progressive global South governments everywhere. They, on the one hand, depend upon primary good exports to fund social welfare, and also in order to attempt to achieve breakthrough development, to break out of their subordinate position within the world capitalist system. But on the other hand, they've also increasingly, in recent decades, faced truly broad-based popular demands for ecological protection. That was the same contradiction you addressed in your earlier book, Resource Radicals. In that case, Ecuador's left-wing president, Rafael Correa, came into conflict over mining with the powerful indigenous movement and environmental activists. You chronicle a similar tension in Chile, where left-wing president Gabriel Boric, who won office riding the wave of this massive 2019 popular uprising. For Boric, lithium presents an opportunity to break out of that dependent model of primary resource exports. But he must also respond to demands from environmentalist and indigenous activists, really key members of his coalition, who contend that more extraction, that it does nothing but reproduce those very same social and ecological harms of economic dependency. First, lay out this broader contradiction between resource nationalism and anti-extractivism, and particularly how it's been playing out in Chile.
I think to set this up a bit, it's worth zooming out to the global south writ large, and then I'll come back to Chile. There is so much policy action right now in global south countries that have large deposits of so-called critical minerals to leverage those minerals to some developmental end, or to kind of renew the decades-long struggle to gain some kind of economic sovereignty in the world. And this is occasioned and maybe helped along in part by the multipolarity of the world system. So we have, the decline of a US-dominated world system, the rise of China, but also the rise of other emerging powers, and a real contestation, which provides openings potentially for global South governments to seek new partners for investment, for collaboration, for technological transfer, for development. But the kind of key question and the key challenge is, if you have cobalt or you have nickel or you have lithium, how do you turn that into a diversified, industrialized, high-tech economy with a highly skilled workforce and all of the economic benefits that come out of that? And so global South governments have been kind of riffing on the toolkit of resource nationalism and of green industrial policy, suiting it to their specific context to do things like quote unquote nationalize their critical mineral sectors. It's not always the classic nationalization where you expropriate a foreign owned asset, but it might be something where you require the foreign company to do business with a state-owned firm. Like they cannot, get the stuff out of the ground unless they partner with a state-owned firm, or unless they do some technological transfer. Or you might have those kind of made in China local content type requirements, but, in other countries in the world, to ensure that local resources are being used for local manufacturing, and you're not just exporting the resources. So there's a lot of different tools we could add, just because it's come up already, that export bans or export controls to kind of keep the raw materials in the country. Indonesia has really mastered this with nickel, in the sense that, for over a decade, Indonesia has had export controls on nickel, which has resulted in no raw nickel leaving Indonesia, and instead it being refined and processed and then further industrialized even into batteries within Indonesia. This, though, just to stay with Indonesia for a moment, and then I'll come back to Chile, has happened at a lot of environmental cost, right? And Indonesian activists are very concerned about this. Indonesian communities, there is nickel mining in primary rainforest in Indonesia. A lot of the nickel mining has also been powered by captive coal plants to power the processing and refining, as well as leading to deforestation of tropical forests. So, that in a nutshell shows you some of the contradiction. You can get a lot of economic development by leveraging your raw materials into like kind of downstream supply chains and bringing in more industrial activity. But this can happen at a lot of environmental cost. And increasingly, as we just talked about earlier, communities don't just simply accept that environmental burden. They organize around it and they contest it. So just like I said, that global north onshoring has also prompted protests in the global north, global south resource nationalism has also been complicated by protests and by environmental and indigenous opposition to this mining. And Chile is an excellent case of that, which is why on the campaign trail and during his inauguration speech, Boric promised two things that sound great and might be theoretically compatible for sure, but in practical reality, for sure also have tensions between them. One is he wanted Chile to increase the amount of lithium mining, maybe to get back to be number one where it used to be before Australia outpaced them. So to increase total lithium mining with new lithium projects on more salt flats, not just the one salt flat that we have now, to also industrialize that lithium so that it's not just that trap of extractivism. Instead, you're getting economic development and more economic sovereignty. on the one hand. On the other hand, he promised an end to sacrifice zones. He promised an end to the process of not respecting indigenous rights. He promised to conserve the biodiversity that makes the northern desert the spectacular landscape that it is. He made all of those promises, and he has, in varying ways and in ways that show the kind of power relations and the tensions between these priorities, made good on these. He is certainly involving the Chilean state more. The state-owned copper company Codelco is now partnering with private firms in joint ventures. He's also opening up new salt flats to contracts for lithium exploitation. He also has set aside a third of salt flats, 1/3 of the total number of them, to be for conservation. And he's also conducted the first prior consultation of indigenous communities for one of these new projects that is a joint venture between SQM and Codelco, which is kind of an amazing meeting of Pinochet's legacy, where you have the state-owned copper company that he established and the lithium company that he privatized now in a joint venture together, and now indigenous communities being consulted, what do you think about this joint venture and the mine that will be produced? And what's interesting is that despite, it being the first successful consultation of indigenous communities around lithium mining, and I don't want to understate the historic importance of that, communities have long demanded that their rights to consultation be respected, and this is the first time the state has, attempted to do so. That consultation process was episodically interrupted by protests on the part of communities that felt like they were not really fully at the negotiating table with the state and the private company, or multiple lawsuits on the part of indigenous communities that said that this is environmentally not viable or doesn't actually fully respect indigenous rights, that the consultations are not substantive enough. So even in the kind of moment of ambition to rewrite history, we see the kind of hard politics of this coming onto the surface. And that's not to say that, the Boric government is not acting in good faith, but this is a very hard set of power relationships and position in the world system to transform. And Chile has similarly tried to bring in battery manufacturing and other downstream parts of the supply chain. And it's been difficult because Chile doesn't already have an industrial ecosystem to support those types of investments and economic activities. And so there's just this chicken and egg problem of how do you get this started? And so I think in the case of Chile, we see, in a way, the best case scenario, because it's a progressive government elected on the heels of a major social uprising. And many other global South governments around the world, they may not be as progressive. They may not have been elected due to a massive, social upheaval. And so the situation might be even less felicitous to kind of counterbalance the developmental goals along with the environmental goals and the demands for indigenous rights protection. But these are the binds that post-colonial states find themselves in, and the energy transition, as futuristic as it is actually a site of all of this historical reckoning, we could say, with these longstanding patterns of underdevelopment, of peripheralization, and of environmental degradation in the global South.
And making matters more difficult, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but the proposed constitution that was really the core project in many ways of the Boric government, the promise to the mass movement of the 2019 uprising, that was voted down in a popular referendum. And what's more, there's a presidential election coming up later this year, and it's predicted that the fascist Pinochet-supporting candidate will defeat the candidate of the left who will be likely coming out of the communist, who will be coming out of the Communist Party.
Yeah, which will have the immediate effect, just to say it, of making anti-mining resistance much more dangerous. Latin America is already the place where the most land defenders are killed in confrontations with mining companies, and mining is already the most dangerous sector on earth for these activists, as I said earlier. And a fascist government does not bode well for basic rights and security in these kind of contentious interactions between communities and corporations.
Right. Even though it's predicted that the Communist Party candidate will lose in the second round, she will still have a very substantial base of support, and it is without question that Chilean popular movements and left political projects will mount a fiery resistance, similar to what we're seeing now in Ecuador, which has a right-wing billionaire president whose repression has sparked a massive uprising from the country's indigenous movement, which really takes us from your first book, Resource Radicals, to where we are today. To close out, why are you drawn to these sorts of dilemmas? Why theoretically and programmatically do you think that these are urgent questions for the left to address, specifically as the left seeks to exercise or actually exercises governing power? Here in the U.S., the most promising, exciting, extraordinarily high-stakes thing happening in terms of advancing a left counter-hegemonic project in the face of the fascist authoritarian threat from the Trump administration is, of course, Zohran Mamdani in New York City. And I know you've been thinking a lot about Zohran. Much of our home life recently has been the two of us talking all the time about Zohran and sharing viral Zohran content amongst ourselves. Recently, you participated in a forum in New York City on lessons for Zohran from Latin America's Pink Tide. And I don't think listeners will be surprised to hear that your analysis is all about navigating contradictions. How should the left think about governance, and specifically about the complex relationship between the left in power and the left in popular movements?
Yeah, I think that the task of left governance is incredibly contradictory because you immediately come to power in a state that has been shaped by capitalists and shaped by class conflict, but also by the most powerful elements in our society. And you come to govern a economic system called capitalism that is not in any way equipped or set up for the goals of left governance, which are more equitable distribution of resources, workers' dignity, making sure everyone has what they need, decommodifying, realms of the economy, reducing environmental harm, addressing the climate crisis. You come to power in an economic system that has produced these crises, and yet you need to use the immediate tools available to you to govern that system, to tame that system, and hopefully to transition to another form of economy. But that's not going to happen immediately. And in the meantime, many of your policy goals might work at cross purposes to one another. I mean, we just talked about this in the realm of resource extraction, which I was initially drawn to many years ago because it puts into apparent tension two core goals of the left in the global South. On the one hand, there's the goal of economic sovereignty and also redistribution of wealth. And on the other hand, there's the goal of a clean environment, a better relationship with nature, the respect for indigenous rights. And those goals are in tension with one another. But, if you're governing, what do? You have these resource sectors that already exist. They are partly the source of potential wealth in order to do the redistribution and fund the social programs and public infrastructure. But the more that you extract, you also harm the environment. You might run roughshod over indigenous rights, et cetera, right? So that's the form that the contradiction takes in Latin America. But, for anywhere that the left governs, one of the trickiest things, whether it's an extractive economy or a tech-dominated economy or a service-dominated economy, it's how do you interact with this capitalist sector and the firms and investors that comprise it when you need resources from them. Like if your goal is to invest in public goods, like you need to channel investment. You need to channel public investment, but you also may need to channel private investment, depending. We're not going to overnight transform capitalism, so private investors will exist for the meantime, but how do we channel them to invest in the right things? You also need to redistribute, which means taxing wealth, taxing assets, redistributing that wealth. And for both of the kind of channeling of investment and the redistribution of wealth, you need to do that with some modicum of cooperation from the ruling class that controls those resources and wealth. But as soon as you start to do that, you will trigger them to backlash against you, to plan for your demise, to engage in capital flight or capital strikes. And so, just with the economy, and we could go to other realms of left governance, like the state itself, or how do you operate in the train of media, or what Gramsci called common sense, or civil society. Like, each of these are already shaped by the inequalities and injustices of the society that exists. They can't be changed overnight. And there is just a careful dance of how much you push, what type of backlash you get, how much you're prepared for that backlash by strong, popular organization that can protect the left-wing project that's in electoral power and use tactics that the government, as left-wing as Zoran might be, certain tactics are not available to a government, but to popular supporters, whether it's strikes or protests or lawsuits or all manner of the repertoire of contention, are available. And we see, time and again in cases of even moderately successful left government, whether at the urban or national level, it's impossible without an organized population, which also then raises the risk that if you lose popular support, which has happened under the Boric government and is not unrelated to the fact that a fascist will probably win, if you lose popular support, you lose the possibility of defending your project from the right. And the Latin American experience in the pink tide, the classic pink tide of the 2000s, the contemporary kind of second pink tide that's happened in other cases really shows that. The opposite, when we look at more successful cases, I think top among them is Scheinbaum in Mexico and maybe secondarily, for example, Lula in Brazil. In those two cases, you have a lot of popular support. And that popular support is downstream of material changes that those governments have achieved, allowing people to understand the connection between the left in power and their own well-being, and also to ideological victories on the train of common sense and ordinary people believing deeply in the project. And that protects it a lot more from reaction. That doesn't reduce the number of contradictions that Scheinbaum and Lula have to deal with every day, but it does strengthen their negotiating hand when they inevitably negotiate and or have tensions with conservative forces or forces of capitalism within their societies. And so I think that, the kind of lesson of resource extraction for me is that if we don't intellectually think about in our conversations on the left, in our organizing strategies, in our designs for policymaking once we're in power, if we don't lean into the places where we have the most potential weakness, because they are the most contradictory aspects of our attempt to gain and deploy power, then we will be undone by our enemies. And it's hard to talk about things that are divisive on the left. Resource extraction in the global South, in Latin America in particular, is divisive on the left. In New York City, issues of how should Zoran deal with policing? How should Zoran deal with the landlord class? These are divisive on the left. But that's because, they are the hardest parts of capitalism or the carceral state that supports it to transform. So of course they're going to be difficult.
They're objective contradictions.
They're objective contradictions given to us in the material reality that is the substrate of left governance. And if we don't talk about them, debate them, tolerate comradely disagreement, think about policy interventions that achieve multiple goals at once, and think about how to reduce the tensions between the goals of the future we want to build, while also reducing the power of the ruling class and its political establishment to undermine us. If we don't think about that in a really concerted and open way within the left, then we're not going to be equipped once we're in power. And I think that's probably the thing I've learned probably the most concretely from studying the history of extraction in Latin America. But I think that basic lesson, even though Zoran's not governing an extractive economy in the sense of a resource economy, but I think that it is the clearest lesson to take to the left in power anywhere, that the shared understanding among people inside and outside the government, but that share the same kind of basic political project, is that left governance is riven with contradiction, which should not resign us to either nihilism or kind of ultra-radicalism, but instead should give us some sense of obligation and fidelity to face those contradictions head on and to design policies, but also stitch together coalitions that can handle the inevitability of tensions on the road to building a better society.
Well, Thea Riofrancos, thank you very much for everything, including this interview.
Thanks for having me.
Thea Riofrancos is a professor of political science at Providence College, strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, and a fellow at the Transnational Institute. She's the author of Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism, Resource Radicals, From Petronationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, and the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio, and please do find us wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really and truly does that is you telling other people to check out the pod. You like the pod, hey, maybe they will too if you tell them about it. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.